Hey guys, Sadie, welcome back to the Hear Me Out podcast. Today I am going to be providing you some food for thought, as I find I do more often than not, in the sense that I'm not providing conclusions. That is the alternative. But here we are. It's what I do best. And this is essentially my most recent research. It's honestly, I'm not going to call it a rabbit hole because it was a very intentional diving into of long form videos, and I was taking notes. I have some notes in front of me here actually, and just kind of over coffee, it was a mixture of David Foster Wallace and Kristen Stewart and James Murphy of LCD Soundsystem, and just a little bit of everything. I was listening to a TED Talk about Manchester and pop culture and counterculture and whatnot with that as well. So I hope to kind of pool all of these ideas in, and I was actually thinking, you know what, to no certain end or no certain change in my behavior, but the thought was still there. I was thinking, well, a lot of the stuff when I do episodes where I cite a lot of things, perhaps that would be better off as a video essay or some kind of long form YouTube video. But alas, here we are in the studio. I hope to provide some context where you don't have any of this going over your head. I want you to kind of understand the situation. At least one interview I'm going to be kind of talking about a little bit in particular. So you're in the know. This isn't this isn't me trying to prove that I am in some kind of pop culture and I know all of these things to cite and whatnot for you. Obviously, I want this to be a fruitful listening experience. So, with all of that said, this began with a video essay, as a lot of things do, which then made me, any good source, what it does is then spurs you into research mode. It is just the stepping stone of you wanting to know more. And it was actually interesting because the video essay that struck this light bulb, essentially, or less of a light bulb, but a fire, it was related to bitterness, which is not what this episode is about, literally at all. But kind of the underlying tone of bitterness, a lot of it had to do with artistry and some things that, if you extrapolate on them, they all led back to big business, as in, consumerism, capitalist society, Fortune 500 companies, whatever. That sort of big business is what I mean when I say that. And I think I'm going to start here actually with then the way the algorithm works 3 videos later, when I was on bitterness, and then I was on being intentional with your time and discipline, and the idea of discipline versus being actually disciplined. And I was thinking a lot about, well, I have videos on my algorithm that are about discipline, which then makes me think subconsciously that I'm a disciplined person, because a non-disciplined person wouldn't have videos about discipline being fed to them, you know what I mean? So then that is dopamine just being fed to me and making me feel good that, oh, I am disciplined. But then you kind of become so enthralled with that you forget to actually translate that into your life, your practice, and being actually disciplined. You'd start to just get obsessed with the idea of sitting in your bed but watching videos that tell you that you're disciplined, sort of thing. And then so on and so forth. We wind up at David Foster Wallace, and it was a 9-minute interview clip that I think was actually pirated on YouTube. I think I wrote down the original source that they had a watermark in, and it was 2LB, I want to say, or no, 2DF. And he starts talking about I have like bookmarks falling out of this journal here, and so it's all, I have the Philly Art Museum receipt from when I was at the Philly Art Museum a few weeks ago. Anyway, so he started talking about like reading and why people don't like to read, which I was particularly interested in, and I agreed with his points as a reader myself. And then lo and behold, again, all came back to big business, and he starts talking essentially about, well, you think of like the Hollywood formula, think blockbusters, think Marvel, and there are things that are profitable, and for something to be profitable, it needs to appeal to tens of millions of people. It's a business. People want to make money. And so then with that, when you need something to appeal to tens of millions of people, you need something people gravitate to that is rather shallow, what he calls David Foster Wallace calls a base interest. And I quoted him, he said, "In our very most base and childish interests, that we are a mass, and yet what makes us really interesting is our niche interests that don't appeal to very many people." And I find that that's really interesting, because there's opportunity for community with the mass interest, hence the very reason it's called like a mass interest. Like, so many people can talk about it. But in terms of where I, speaking from my experience, actually find community, it is when you feel like an other in your interests, until all of a sudden you see someone reading a book you've never heard of anyone else reading but you, or someone is playing a vinyl track or something, and you think, oh my gosh, I've never heard anyone else know of that song, whatever, and I was almost gatekeeping it. And that was a funny anecdote that James, what's his face, of LCD Soundsystem, the main guy, James Murphy, in one of the long form videos where he was talking about how he came to success and all of that stuff, he was talking about how he was just kind of lame, and he was in New York, and he's 26, and he finally starts doing something, and he starts trying to make his music company, and he was DJing places, and he kind of felt cool for once. Then one time he went to a bar, someone else had then been DJing with the same tracks that he prided himself on for playing, because no one else was playing them, until all of a sudden someone was. And instead of taking that opportunity to be like, oh my gosh, I found my people, I found my place, let me talk to this person after, we can hit it off, he talked about how he was very embarrassed about it, actually, and suddenly he felt not special. But anyway, in the event that you kind of have a healthy relationship with what you have to bring to the table, and instead of being like, oh wait, now I'm not one of one, I'm one of two and can talk to someone about, like, instead of getting down on yourself and being embarrassed, which the singer came full circle and didn't necessarily look fondly on his old take, if you kind of actually just jump at the opportunity and see it as, oh, it's something to connect over, that is inherently like deeper is the word that comes to mind, but in the sense that it's not a shallow connection of, okay, well, everyone and their mother ever has seen Barbie, or like read has read some Colleen Hoover book or something like that. You know, that appeals to the masses, but then real fun conversations that it almost feels like a soul tie jumping out is when you've like literally never seen anyone else engage with that. Anyway, but so he was talking about these base and childish interests being what's marketed, and what doesn't sell is actually what is what makes us interesting, which I think is true more times than not. But then the way YouTube works, you are watching your main video, and then on a column to the right, you see recommended videos. One of those recommended videos, I engage with the New York Times, so that's part of it, but one of the recommended was a long-form interview with Kristen Stewart, who just came out in 2025 with a movie called The Chronology of Water. And the thumbnail of the interview was different from the title. The title was basically quoting her saying that Hollywood was in a capitalist hell. But then the thumbnail was quoting her saying she doesn't self-censor herself. And I thought that was such an interesting dichotomy to have someone in Hollywood, someone incredibly well known, incredibly well off, saying, I don't self-censor. And then on the other hand, you have this writer and professor, David Foster Wallace, saying, well, actually, what you do inevitably self-censor is what that does not sell. So those are conflating views. And I wrote down, just off the thumbnail before I clicked on it, I wrote down in my journal, quote, I don't self-censor, end quote, says Kristen Stewart, who can afford to. It's only after she gave to a franchise to a great capitalist success, which gave her access to the Hollywood machine, that she can subvert its expectations or deny its formulas, maybe. She is the mass appeal, which can then be sold when her work perhaps cannot, as itself, like in a vacuum. It wouldn't appeal to the base and childish interests, which David Foster Wallace discussed. So I was thinking about that, and I was like, oh, that conflates. That's interesting. But then I thought about it more. It actually went really well together, because it ends up affirming his point, because even though, and I kind of got to it in what I just read out loud, but Kristen Stewart herself is that base interest, that mass appeal to people, and the idea that she is her own brand. And I was so appreciative that actually when I clicked on this video, it is so incredibly interesting. And I find personally, I know she's not everyone's cup of tea, but she just kind of sucked me in, and I love her energy. I highly recommend. And they have an interesting structure to the interview in the sense that it's 2 parts, but without going too into the form, you should watch it. Kristen Stewart, New York Times, the interview. Without going too much into the form, though, she very quickly or very soon says that she acknowledges this idea that she wouldn't have gotten financing for this movie, The Chronology of Water, had she not been her. Because it's hard to market, because she goes on to say, well, when you pitch it to big studios, a lot of the times a formula for that is if you have a movie, my movie is actually this other movie meets this other movie, 2 of which were very profitable. So the marriage of those profitable movies would make item C, which would then be her movie, profitable. She said that she couldn't do that because her movie was so singular, and that made it off the bat very hard. And I disclaimer, I haven't seen it, but I tend to know a lot about movies before I watch them, and I watched directors on director segment that Variety hosts that I've talked about on this podcast before with Kristen Stewart and Jesse Eisenberg, who are friends, and they were speaking of this movie. So I am familiar with the fact that it is not a traditional cut of a movie, and it makes a lot of statements with its form, much less its content, and the content seems to deserve a trigger warning. But it's about this competitive swimmer who grapples with trauma in her life. And Kristen Stewart herself said it's a lot about not picking apart a woman so that she can just be a person. And it's a lot about a woman being afforded to speak and all of that. So anyway, she soon acknowledges, well, if I wasn't me, this couldn't have come to fruition, essentially, couldn't have gotten funding. And I appreciated that so much, because I find a lot of celebrities are quick to become out of touch, and it's really awkward to acknowledge money. And it's really awkward when, especially faced in a conversation with someone who makes a lot less money from you, when they kind of challenge being like, oh, well, you must be rich or something. And it's a little better when there's no question about it, but when there's almost a are you not better off position than me, it leads to jabs or just like really awkward comebacks. Like, let's say you are in a well-off position, you're fortunate to have been positioned with parents who are well off, and something you say maybe tips someone off that you are born into this family of comfort in a financial sense, and they just kind of go, oh, well, you must be rich, aren't you? And it's just like, what do you say to that? What do you say to that? Well, yes, I'm very fortunate to have been, but there's a rift that happens there. So this situation with at least Kristen Stewart, she, like, after the Twilight franchise, when she was 17 years old, like, one of her first projects, or at least early in her life, she never had to worry about money again. So she acknowledges that, exactly, but then that is the very point of, well, still she herself is the brand, which appeals to those quote unquote base interests, again, which is just something that can be mass marketed. And that is enough in this sense, even when the actual content is not a base interest, and it's rather the second part of what David Foster Wallace is saying, which is actually what makes Kristen Stewart interesting and the story interesting. And it's unlike many other movies, from my understanding of it, not having seen it. I hope to watch it this weekend, honestly, because I've been hearing about it for weeks now. But so it went from me seeing that thumbnail to be like, oh, that's so contradictory, almost out of touch, to wait, those two things actually complement themselves really well. And shout out actually another really tasteful piece of media I consumed recently. Luke Combs went on Jay Shetty's On Purpose podcast, and they were talking a lot about money, and Luke Combs had the best, most thoughtful things to say about it, I thought. And he was very honest in the fact that he just he feels really awkward knowing that he is well off, and other people, or excuse me, let me finish this thought. So he's very well off, and country music is a lot about blue collar storytelling, working class, on the large, I'd say, like working class, scraping by, family oriented, sort of thing. And that doesn't necessarily lend itself to a lifestyle of so much money, dare I say, and on the large. And he was saying, so I write about all of these things, and I can't necessarily tap into it the same way I did anymore, or the same way I used to. And it doesn't go over his head that he knows, like, he's singing about money not being the most important thing in life, and yet it's so easy to say that when you actually have money. So I highly recommend that interview. That is a long one. I think I actually still have had about 30 minutes left in it, because it's like a 2-hour interview or something. So I never fully got through it, but there was a lot of interesting things. But all just to praise him and Kristen Stewart, who they were not out of touch, and they were very blunt about that sort of thing. And I find that that's really refreshing. But so then, if you didn't hear what I had written, I'm gonna reread it one more time, because my next idea is essentially debating, do you need to contribute to, in quotes, the machine before you can deny it? So what I wrote this morning again, Kristen Stewart contributed to a franchise, to a great capitalist success, which gave her access to the Hollywood machine that she can subvert its expectations or deny its formulas, perhaps. She is the mass appeal, which can be sold when her work perhaps cannot, as it in a vacuum wouldn't appeal to the base and childish interests, which Foster Wallace discussed. So, do you need to essentially swallow your pride when you don't agree with uber capitalism in order to have access to resources, whether that be money, people, whatever? Do you almost have to like swallow your pride to get on the in before you can then deny the system, before you can be afforded the chance to actually say, well, no, here is real artistry in a vacuum that was made because I have enough money to make something that is unprofitable, that doesn't have butts and seats at the theater sort of thing. I was thinking a lot about that, and my knee-jerk reaction, I want to say, well, yes, because again, like, money's such an awkward thing, and then that was leading me to, well, the starving artist trope, essentially, to be short of that, directly was leading it to where if you never necessarily succumb to these buzzer words, if you deny the algorithm, capitalism, whatever, and from the get-go you are in your niche, you stay in your niche, you do not care to market yourself to the mainstream, you don't hop on TikTok to promote that, which I think I made 2 videos talking about this podcast, and it kind of made me want to throw up. Like, it just felt really gross to me. And so in these TikToks, it was essentially promoting the podcast, but then with the only idea of like, if you want a friend, if you want someone ranting, I originally pitched the show being like, it's a voice memo from your friend. Like, if you want that, the podcast is here for you, but it's not claiming to be anything else. And so that was my rationalization in terms of, okay, I'm posting that video with that caption being up front. I'm not trying to do any like fun, savvy video edits, whatever. But so if you never even do that in a very primitive sense of media, if you don't even engage to the 2 video level that I did, and there's a great chance that you will not become popular, become profitable from your work, whether it be podcasting or painting or whatever it is. There's a great chance, unless, again, with the social media thing, you happen to maybe just like put one video out there and it randomly goes viral and then that changes the course of your life. But if you were just to create and not promote, but you're just creating for the sense of creating and that's your calling, well, you need to find a way to make a living, period, like in some other realm of your life, and almost do that on the side. Yeah, because if you don't contribute to this quote unquote machine, again, I'm using that interchangeably with mainstream notions of capitalism and the way that the system works, that at the end of the day you gotta put bread in your mouth sort of thing, and pitch things to masses and all that stuff. So like, if you're making things that don't appeal to people and you have no desire to appeal to a lot of people, I think that's incredibly admirable. And you then, yeah, essentially the starving artist is a trope, and I don't know. I don't know if I necessarily like that trope, but not to get bogged down in that is essentially, I guess, what I'm getting at. And then, without digressing, there was a question in the original bitterness related essay I started off talking about, which was, am I entitled to live off of my artistry, essentially? Am I entitled to being able to be an artist and have that passion lead the way, lead my life to a sustainable along a sustainable track? And the answer, I think, is no. The person conducting the video essay, I've shouted her out. I'm eluding her name, but her name is Mickey Galvin, and highly recommend. Not claiming necessarily any of these ideas. Again, just all bouncing off of them. So Mickey Galvin was quoting someone else. So then it's a whole ladder. It's a whole game of telephone when it comes to quoting our sources, isn't it? But so she was saying that she also kind of thinks the answer to that is no, you're not entitled to make a living off your art. But that answer made her really bitter at that idea, which I think, frankly, is fair. Do I feel a sense of bitterness from it? No, I don't. No, I don't think so. It's unfortunate for sure, but I don't think what I'm feeling related to that would be characterized as bitter. Again, though, I said, let's not digress. But then, like the domino effect of, okay, so then talking about the machine and blah, 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 whatever, and then how Kristen Stewart could make this seemingly camp movie, and how that seems to be doing well in its screening, and then also finding connection. This is leading off the point of finding beyond transitory, beyond shallow connection, that next level. I think that is found in being the other, in being part of a counterculture. And like, you can't have counterculture without a machine. It's just the way it works. Like, if everything was accepted, if everything was, just open, not judged, money wasn't necessarily factored into it, and even if it was, even like, let's say these indie movies are getting financed without issue, whatever, then it would be like, okay, there's nothing to push back against. And as humans, I think we have an inherent need almost to challenge, to push back against something, to stick it to the man more times than not. And without this unfortunate crushing structure, like made up of all these institutions, without that, then you can't have, there's nothing to push back against to then say, we stand apart, this is what we fight for, we're contrarian, and in that we are special, because there's with that a great risk of needing to have multiple jobs or not making profit on this project, whatever it may be, after years of working on it or whatever. And that's such a specific dynamic and specific type of people that you must be passionate about something if you're in that bucket. And then because of that, you find your people, you find your community. And I believe this is making sense. I hope this is making sense. But then I mentioned earlier how I was watching a TED Talk, or listening really to a TED Talk about Manchester, and it was titled, like the headline was about pop culture, and it kind of was and kind of wasn't, but it was the tip of the iceberg in discussing counterculture in Manchester. And if you're not familiar, Manchester was a great space for the Industrial Revolution in particular, in the factories, and but then you get into the 80s and it's known for its music scene, and it's the Smiths were born out of Manchester. The Oasis was born out of Manchester. New Order, and all. You could go on and on about these great names of music that were born out of Manchester, based in Manchester. And you have this club called the Hacienda, and that was massive. Apparently I was in Manchester last year, and I was talking to this tour guide, and they were going on giving this anecdote about but Madonna allegedly, is what I meant to say, performed at the Hacienda, but she denies it to this day or something. I don't know. But so now Madonna's in this mix, even though we know she's not from Manchester. And but then you have, incredibly enough, in an unfortunate way, counterculture then becomes commodified. If you have a counterculture that takes off in the way that Manchester did, it wasn't the cool thing, and it was almost like threatening, and it was the only place in the world, according to this TED Talk, it was the only place in the world, the only city that could have reaped this sort of thing. And it should have shut down for one reason or another, whatever, and like the government should have stopped it, whatever, and it didn't. And then given time, then it flourished, and you have all these record sales and so on and so forth. But then naturally people would come. They were talking, this TED Talk, they were talking about like, and I'm going to link this. I'm going to get better at linking my sources below, because as I said, even though I'm not necessarily interested in the video essay format, I think if you wanted to, it would be helpful to click these links. So there's about 3 or 4 links if you're interested following up, or even pausing this and maybe just listening to 30 seconds of that could be good and fun for you. So I'll link that below. But so this TED Talk was then basically saying these like business people would come essentially, and they'd be in their meetings and they'd be like, okay, like we're done now, can we go to the Hacienda? And then now like Manchester is being promoted for its counterculture, and then it actually isn't a counterculture at all, it's just culture, period. It's the mainstream. And I think that is a bit of a mind, I'm trying not to curse, fill in the blank there, but that is like, oh, so aggravating. And I think every counterculture legend's worst nightmare to then become mainstream, and people are using you and your work to like put on flyers and promote things. But shout out also the 1975. They're from Cheshire, which is about 10 minutes outside of 10 to 20 minutes of a drive outside of Manchester. So their hometown show is Manchester. Big fan of the 1975. They're from there too. Really just a great place for a lot of great music. But then I'm going to quote said TED Talk, quote, "The most powerful art is unbothered by official culture and big business and their agendas," end quote. But I just thought that was ironic, because then the TED Talk basically discussed how Manchester counterculture was then commodified, as I was then just going on a rant for a second. So it became bothered by, quote, official culture, in the way that when anything gains traction, the way our society works, like you just want to jump on it. And it's almost kind of like, okay, well, what level of contrarian can I be? What level of maybe like minor success, even though you don't do it for success, that's kind of written into the syllabus of just doing it for the hell of doing it. But if you were to kind of find your people to the point, to what great extent can then you live a perfect life sustainably off of this art, without it being blown out of proportion, and then all of a sudden against your entire message, and once other people come in and are essentially taking advantage, I guess, of these messages and of what you're producing. So then when I was watching, I think it was about a 10-minute video, James Murphy of LCD Soundsystem actually mentioned David Foster Wallace, his book. He wrote a book titled Infinite Jest. He's written many books. Unfortunately, he is not still alive to this day. One of his books, I believe, is called I added it to my Goodreads this morning. Oh, I'm blanking on it, but it was an unfinished work that when he had passed away, it was unfinished, and it ended up going on to be nominated for a Pulitzer, I believe, some grand prize like that, but I believe it was a Pulitzer. And I'm interested in reading that one. I don't know so much about Infinite Jest, which is over 1,000 pages, but James Murphy read this massive book and said it depressed him. And I had literally never heard of David Foster Wallace before this morning, perhaps. And then all of a sudden, again, crazy way the algorithm works, I see through it. It's not, anyway, all of a sudden, like, LCD Soundsystem main singer is talking about David Foster Wallace. It's like, of all of the videos I could have watched of James Murphy, of course, it's going to be the one that mentions the person in the video I was watching 1 or 2 videos prior, sort of thing. So I was just throwing that out in there, and just funny way these things all connect. But yeah, I think just then to say LCD Soundsystem is a good example of being contrarian, that all of the other contrarian people in the world, people who have felt othered, people who have tastes that aren't necessarily for the light of heart and ear, they all of a sudden jump on it. It's like everyone ever who falls under that category then finds LCD Soundsystem, and all of a sudden it's like it's a mainstream voice for the contrarians, or for maybe not, again, so contrarian as just not for the light of heart and ear. I liked that. I think that was a good way of putting it. So I'll say it again. Listen to LCD Soundsystem if you're unfamiliar. They are a band led by, as I've said, James Murphy. I was listening to All My Friends, which is one of their more popular songs, probably one of my favorite songs of theirs. Was listening to that this past December when I was home, and I was doing something, maybe folding laundry with my mom, and the intro is quite a long one. I think it's about 45 seconds, give or take, of just instrumentals, and it's repetitive. And when I heard it for the first time, I was arrested by it. I loved it. My mom, her ears were bleeding. She said, "Turn this off, please, now. God, do not let this song go on any longer." So that is the exact thing here, the vibe here. Listen to All My Friends, though, or I think I Can Change has been on repeat for me recently, but I'm blanking on their main one. Oh, just when I was about to look it up, I remembered Dance Yourself Clean. Dance Yourself Clean and All My Friends, I would say, is a more palatable of the unpalatable. So go ahead and listen to those. Do yourself a favor and listen to the lyrics. Listen to the lyrics. Quote, "I would not trade one stupid decision for another 5 years of life." Bar. Bar, bar, bar. Okay, that's the last I'll say about LCD Soundsystem. Okay, last main point. This then all got me thinking about the Golden Globes when Paul Thomas Anderson, I think is his name, yes, One Battle After Another, the writer-director of that, he got up on stage and he was probably the Best Director award, actually, and he shouted out Mike DeLuca, who is, I think, he's like on the board, or he's the CEO, or he's very high up at Warner Brothers, and he credited Mike DeLuca with his film even taking off, or not taking off, but even being able to be made. And he had said it's when you allow directors to make the movies that they want to make and have creative freedom, you get movies like One Battle After Another, like Weapons, like Sinners that won Best Movie, Best Picture at the Oscars this year. And that was because Ryan Coogler had full creative freedom, and he pitched this movie with the script, but also with Michael B. Jordan had to be in the lead, and this is who the camera person had to be, and so on and so forth. And it was very much like, this is going to be the way or you're not getting it, but just trust me with this vision. It can be an Oscar-winning movie sort of thing. It can be profitable. So Paul Thomas Anderson was basically saying, because of a Warner Brothers head, again, because financing is such a real thing here, like we can't just live naive. But if you do push for almost the risk, the counterculture camp of it all, to then become almost the standard of mainstream, like, this is what people have a craving for. They is of course very dangerous when you make these generalizations, but I would like to believe that as a US oriented culture, at least that is obviously my perspective, that we are almost ready to not reinvent the wheel, but just to have a new non-formulaic media structure, movie structure. And Marvel is great, but what are they even producing anymore, you know? After Endgame, it was just kind of slowly going downhill, in my not so humble opinion. And then, yeah, like, we just want the sinners of it all. So, like, let's push for those who finance the movies to understand that this is the way, this is what people are calling for, like, and you will be profitable if you lean into that, if you lean into the sinners in One Battle After Another of it all. So then maybe it's what makes us interesting, to loop it all back to David Foster Wallace, what makes us interesting, then there's just then greater opportunity, I guess, is what this all means. There will be greater, more frequent opportunity for non-shallow connections that aren't off of our base and childish interests, but the interests that are near and dear to our heart. I don't know. But again, I think there is then always going to be the value of the nuggets of counterculture, and not everything needs to become mainstream. And I think it's always fun and lovely and just energy refilling moments when, again, you hear someone listening to a song that was your favorite song forever and you never heard of anyone else knowing. And then all of a sudden you have this moment of connection, if only for 30 seconds. But okay, a little bit of a pivot, but last thing I want to leave you with, that is then off this main subject, is something I read in a book recently. I'm currently reading a book called The Silent Period, and her name is Francesca. Oh man, I'm blanking on her last name, but The Silent Period, an Italian author, and it's a translated work. But one of the lines I'm paraphrasing in her book, which I want to leave you as food for thought, is the main character had said, "I really like people who speak slowly. Those are people who are not afraid of not being listened to." I butchered that. She said it much more eloquently, but I thought a lot about attention economy and how creators tend to talk fast so as to jam everything they want to say in a little bit while they have your 10 seconds of attention before you swipe. I thought a lot about that, and I want to encourage you to speak at whatever cadence comes natural to you. If that's fast, great, but if it's slow, do not speed up your speaking for the sake of another's attention. Those who are considerate, those who are worth your time, will give you time, and they will listen no matter how slow you speak. That really struck me, and I challenged myself to do the same thing. And I had made a video where I knew I was talking slow. I watched it back, and I deleted that video so as to re-record it and speak faster, all to then realize when I was laying in bed that night, this is exactly what I don't want to do. This is the opposite of the confidence that those 2 lines in the book I was reading had been talking about. And I liked to think that I was confident in what I brought to the table and the cadence with which I spoke, but that very anecdote contradicts that. So I won't repeat it. Just do that. I trust you were listening. Anyway, I hope you have an amazing day whenever this episode finds you, whether it is on the Sunday it airs or somewhere afterward or sometime afterward. As always, follow the Instagram at HBU Hear Me Out. If you're watching this on YouTube, give a little like or subscribe if you feel like this. The audio just cut out again. It's being weird today. Subscribe if you're on YouTube. Follow the pod if you're on Spotify. Again, only if you feel like it. If you got this far, though, and you don't do any of those things, but you got this far, I really, really appreciate it. I cannot tell you enough how much I appreciate you guys being here. I will see you next Sunday. Thanks so much.